The Netanyahu faction is by far the most dangerous group surrounding Trump. These are essentially the same Zionists or neocons that made up the Project for the New American Century think tank, which called for 9/11 and then eventually came up with a hit list of the 7 countries, and then the Clean Break document, which capped it all off, that echoes the hit list that we're seeing continued to this day. Trump's deputy campaign manager and national political director, Michael Glassner, was a senior advisor under Louis Eisenberg. Louis was the chairman for the Port Authority in New York and New Jersey until July of 2001, when he transferred the World Trade Center real estate to Trump's good friend, Larry Silverstein, just a couple months before the buildings were demolished by Zionist powers within the United States. Larry made $4.55 billion on the insurance plan that he took out just a month before that covered terrorism.
The developer is actually a friend of mine, but he didn't want to build this building either. If you look back at the records, I mean, when it was first foisted upon him, Larry Silverstein is a great guy, he's a good guy, he's a friend of mine.
Glassner also worked for the parent company of Genie Energy, who has massive energy interests in the Golan Heights region of Syria. There are major corporate interests for Genie. They have been given exclusive rights to explore for oil and gas in the Golan Heights region, which I like to call Israeli-occupied Syria. On the board of Genie Energy, you will see people like the Rothschilds, Rupert Murdoch, Bill Richardson, and Dick Cheney. These are the people that are surrounding Trump. These are the Zionists. These are the neocons. These are the people that have Trump's ear. Glassner credits his former boss, IDT founder Howard Jones, who he called, quote, a strong Zionist and AIPAC guy, for making him more active in Zionist politics. Between 2000 and 2008, Glassner worked on George Bush's campaign and fundraised for Bush's 2004 re-election effort.
I think you're going to have probably George Bush as your next president. He's an excellent guy, an excellent man. He's a friend of mine, and I'm here for that reason.
Well, Larry Silverstein is a great guy, he's a good guy, he's a friend of mine.
I'm here because I'm a guest of Vice President Bush, Mrs. Bush, the Mothbachers, and some others.
You give to George. You've already contributed to him, haven't you?
Well, I contributed to him, and I've helped him a little bit, and I guess I'll help him a little bit more, and I'm not sure that he needs anybody's help. I think so far, I really think he's conducted himself brilliantly.
Here's another interesting quote from Glassner. Quote, my interest in pro-Israel politics has grown exponentially, particularly since 9/11. I have pointed out Trump's other Zionist cabinet members in my previous Donald Trump Exposed videos. I will link those in the description. Feel free to check those out. In conclusion, I'm going to leave you with some interesting Trump clips that have to do with 9/11. Trump may just be one of these boys. He may just be a neocon.
We rebuild the World Trade Center in the form of a skeleton, Freedom Tower, the terrorists win. We want to rebuild the World Trade Center as the World Trade Center, but better, a little bit taller, a lot stronger, just plain.
A lot of people ask, how is it possible that a Boeing plane would be able to destroy or 2 planes would be able to destroy the Twin Towers? Because they were constructed to withstand like a 707 attack.
Well, it's tremendous power and tremendous heat, and people were willing to die, and when they're willing to die and when they're willing to become kamikazes of a sense, there's very little you can do about it. I mean, the heat and the power, actually it was amazing that the initial jolts didn't jar the building as much as people would have thought, but the tremendous amounts of fuel that was dumped on the building and 1,600 degrees temperature, I guess that's probably more than anything could take, no matter what. Larry Silverstein is a great guy, he's a good guy, he's a friend of mine.
Debris.
Donald, you're probably the best known builder, particularly of great buildings in the city. There's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement. Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation, and it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid, and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows, you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams, when I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or a 747, or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have, and it was almost just like a can of soup.
You know, Donald, we were looking at pictures all morning long of that plane coming into building number 2, and when you see that approach the far side, and then all of a sudden, within a matter of a millisecond, the explosion pops out the other side.
Right. I just think that it was a plane with more than just fuel. I think, obviously, they were very big planes. They were going very rapidly because I was also watching where the plane seemed to be not only going fast, it seemed to be coming down.
Very strongly. I do feel very strongly about the country. I love the country, but...
About your acquisition of the boat this summer. The Princess, is that what I
I
call
bought a
it?
boat from Adnan Khashoggi, which was formerly called the Nabila. And
Nabila.
It's a yacht. And
Adnan Khashoggi, excuse me for a second, is the world's largest arms trader?
I hate to admit it. Actually, it was from the Sultan of Brunei because he was security for a loan and a whole complicated thing. But
Now, what are those guys like?
oh, they're real sweethearts, I have to think. They're real sweethearts.
Are they mean, tough, foreboding guys?
Well, I'd say by nature they're not the nicest guys in the world.
Yeah.
You know, he spent probably $200 million on building this yacht.
We got involved in this Iran-Contra story, which unfortunately backfired a little bit on everybody. They asked me to finance it. I said, okay. So I gave credit to the CIA for $1 million, and they shipped the equipment, and the Iranian paid me back. It was supposed to be a hush-hush operation. As business people, we have ways of manipulating the government officials, and they have ways of manipulating us. I take advantage of opportunities that come. In all relationship in the world, when you have contact, like if I have contact with you now, I'll call you when I arrive in New York and say, hi, Adnan, I want to see you. There's nothing abnormal. You probably will take me out to dinner and introduce me to another person who I make business with.
You would say you're not an arms dealer and you never were?
No. The truth is, if you investigate through the records and so on, you find out we never dealt in arms. It was just a title given to us by the press.
But when you helped connect the United States government and the Saudi government over sales of weapons, what would you call that?
Marketing.
It says the process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Was 9/11 your Pearl Harbor?
I think it was the country's Pearl Harbor.
How can you prevent something like this from happening? Because I had heard that some of the foreign press had gotten some warnings that this was going to happen, that there was going to be a catastrophic, devastating event that was going to happen today. But those warnings happened last week, the week before, the week before, the week before. And when somebody comes along with a scenario like this that almost seems like a Hollywood script, how can you prevent something like that?
When the plane flew into one of the two towers which we saw before our eyes, you thought, well, you know, it's like the graphic artist, isn't it?
Bush was quick to use 9/11 to build up his image. At the same time, he is refusing to cooperate fully with the commission investigating the attacks on America.
Thanks so much, gentlemen. Just a quick note before we move on here. As we take a look of the debris field, we have a lot of correspondence very close into ground zero. I wanted to share with you a fact that really is quite staggering. We have learned that 11.8 metric tons of gold, worth an estimated $110 million, and 30.2 million ounces of silver, valued at $121 million, is buried in the rubble below one of the collapsed buildings of the World Trade Center. And this belongs to people or firms that trade future contracts on the New York Mercantile Exchange. The market's, of course, opening tomorrow. The mayor reiterating he very much wants New Yorkers to get back to their normal lives.
I had been notified that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. At first I thought it was a light aircraft. And my reaction was, man, either the weather was bad or something extraordinary happened to the pilot.
I'd like to ask you about the August 6th PDB.
Sure.
You mentioned it at Fort Hood on Sunday. You pointed out that it did not warn of a hijacking of airplanes to crash into buildings, but
Right.
that it warned of hijacking to obviously take hostages and to secure the release of extremists being held by the U.S. Did that trigger some specific actions on your part in the administration, since it dealt with potentially hundreds of lives and a blackmail attempt on the United States government?
Yeah. It was also an indication, as you mentioned, that that bin Laden might want to hijack an airplane, but as you said, not to fly into a building, but perhaps to release a person in jail. In other words, you serve it as a blackmail. And of course that concerns me. All those reports concern me. I haven't seen any evidence. I've seen no evidence today that said this country could have prevented the attack. No, I know. Well, listen, there's all kinds of speculation. As I said, I have seen no evidence that would have led me to believe that we could have prevented the attacks. And obviously, if we could have, we would have prevented the attacks. Never did in anybody's thought process about how to protect America did we ever think that the evildoers would fly not one, but 4 commercial aircraft into precious U.S. targets.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
Thought that some foolish soul had gotten lost and made a terrible mistake. I was sitting outside the classroom waiting to go in, and I saw an airplane hit the tower of a TV. You know, the TV was obviously on, and I used to fly myself, and I said, well, there's one terrible pilot. And it said it must have been a horrible accident.
Take the day off, they're blowing up the building. It's terrorist attacks, go home. They're blowing up the building.
I was sitting there, and my chief of staff, well, first of all, when we walked in the classroom, I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on, and you know, I thought it was pilot error. And I was amazed anybody could make such a terrible mistake. And you know, something was wrong with the plane, or, you know.
I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, you know, it's time for politics. And it's an absurd insinuation.
The developer is actually a friend of mine, but he didn't want to build this building either. If you look back at the records, I mean, when it was first foisted upon, Larry Silverstein is a great guy. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine.